what, it was life. And I think sometimes that's about, let's demystify. I genuinely understand academically. I understand why when we're teaching, I understand from the theoretical perspectives of talking about trauma as a word. I understand absolutely the importance of recognizing about adversities. I have it in the model. I understand that. But I think in doing so, we also put a barrier between ourselves as practitioners in questioning our ability to do things. And I suppose I'm one of these people, which is, do you know what? Put the technical words to the side and let's just ask the questions. Because for me, for example, starting out as a psychiatric social worker at 21, 22 years of age, I was dealing with, whenever I stood in those wards of female and acute male patients in a psychiatric ward, with poverty, unemployment, poor, inadequate housing, all of those sorts of huge, huge social problems based alongside these people's existence of growing up in my era of the Troubles, which was about fear, death, threats, and worry. But then that was also around in terms of dealing with their family, their community, their county, their country. And that had nothing then, never mind on top of that, the external factors in terms of other countries and other people and other organizations and everybody believing that they had an input and a say in terms of what was going on for us. So therefore, I started my work in knowing that I could never see a person in a psychiatric ward or their family solely by what was at that time potentially whatever was their diagnosis, but it was about recognizing that biopsychosocial. And I've seen that word written now so many times. And I remember it was with a colleague of Martin's where we established to me, I will always be very committed to it, even though it no longer is working. A psychosexual services and a program for prevention of sexual abuse, working with people who had committed sexual harmful behaviour, but who had been unconvicted, but also with victims of sexual trauma, as well as people with psychosexual problems. And that was back in 1996, whenever I was writing an operational guidance on that the fundamental principles of the way in which we will work with individuals will be from a biopsychosocial perspective. And that is really what I'm asking you to do. So albeit I want, the word of trauma, can we break that down into what do we mean? I want you to consider that young person biologically, how are they? Psychologically, what's gone on for them, and socially, where do they live, what's happened for them. If we use that word of trauma, I think what tends to happen is we put up a barrier, because it's about having respect for their perception of their life, and it's about having respect for the resilience of how they have coped with that life, and that's okay. And we might want to label that as self-harming type behaviors, but you know what, it's about respecting resilience of how people have coped. It's about not therefore seeing somebody through a trauma lens, but it's seeking to understand them, their behaviors, their thoughts, their feelings, their cognitions through the multitude of lenses. There's no one lens. There's no, what is a trauma lens? There's no one lens to see a young person through, but it's about how do they see the world and how has that world been informed by. But it's also remembering, and it's one of the greatest things I ever learned in terms of working in sort of at an early 20 years of age, working in border counties and living within the Troubles. And this was sadly pre-Oma bombing and post-Oma bombing, and living within that, is that the questions I needed to ask a person as to why they were unwell, exactly the same way when I was working in the psychosexual services and working with somebody who'd come in and was disclosing to me that they had been sexually abusing whoever that was that to be aware that the questions that you ask need to be asked in a way that I recognize the fear of answering them. Think about that. Always ask your question with a recognition of the fear for a young person in answering them. And that's what we mean by really getting a real sense of what do we mean about asking questions to seek to understand, not to seek about gathering just irrelevant information. So very much this model is about trying to, I suppose for me, about really building up an understanding of that young person. That developmental trauma is that term used to describe the impact of early repeated abuse, neglect, separation, those adverse experiences that have come into that young person's life. And for me, I like this picture because I think it always reminds me, within that adult there is a wounded child, and within that wounded child there is so many things that have wounded that child. And it's a bit like, for example, whenever I finish with this today, I'm about to do a piece on domestic homicide reviews, and that's because a member of my family was murdered in a domestic homicide. And one of the things I will always seek to understand, whenever somebody said to me, the last week I was doing some work on domestic violence, and the person said to me, yes, the young person was experiencing adversity. You know, whenever he was a young child, he experienced domestic violence. And what I had to remind that person was that no, from the moment of his conception, of the 9 months perinatally in the womb, his mother lived with domestic abuse and violence. His mother lived with the sickening anticipation of when was the next time she was going to be hit. His mother lived with that fear. He grew in the womb of fear. His womb had consistently, his cocoon inside his mommy's body was already impacted from how she was trying to survive on a day-to-day basis. So he didn't live with domestic violence when he was born. He was growing with it inside perinatally. And I think it is that. And this was a case in relation to where this young person has gone on to commit harmful sexual behavior. And it's about really beginning to understand that it's not about just when that young person was born, but it's about what was that like for their mother at the time? What was that environment like at the time? So it's really about making sure we go right back to the very start of how and when and their conception and the nature of their conception, and what was that like for them. And so for me, there's a much more of an understanding of that 7 pieces of the developmental puzzle that I would always say to people in training. Think about it in terms of sensory. What does that mean for this young person? So for example, in the domain 1, whenever we're looking at what is the behaviors the young person has done, what I want you to be able to do, if we're looking at it really, if you want to use that term, the trauma lens, or whatever that term fits best within you and your professional background, for me, what I want to know is, what did that feel like? It's from a sensory point of view. And what did that feel like? So for me, it's about, what did you see? What did you hear? What did you smell? What words were said? So it's really about making sure we get a real sense of understanding that from that developmental, what does that feel like for them? Rather than just about what did you do? It's about understanding things like how developmental trauma can affect us in terms of our dissociation. It's about absolutely our attachment development. I mean, that's a whole other pathway of discussion. But it's about our emotional regulation, our behavior regulation, it's about our cognition, but it's fundamentally about who we are and what we bring into the world and how we are and what has formed and shaped and molded me to the person that I am. So if I am a young person that from the day and hour in which I was conceived, that my mother lived in a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week fear of the person of whom she was living with at that time, and then we wonder why that young person then, whenever they are born, in terms of their ability to relax, their ability to be safe, their ability to not be constantly alert to things, the labeling then potentially of the ADHD, the labeling then potentially then later on down of that inability to concentrate. Let's just make sure we have a much more developmental awareness of that biopsychosocial. So biologically, what has happened to this young person, as well as moving into that psychological. If we look now in terms of going into each one of the domains, domain 1, as I said to you, looks at the young persons, what are the behaviors. And again, I mean, the model has been designed very clearly to be able to take it, and this is genuinely not minimizing. I, of all people, wouldn't want to do that. I wanted to create a model that, even if you're somebody who is relatively new to the HSB field and is relatively new to assessing HSB, that the model will guide you to be able to ask questions. Think about this, analyze this. These are things that you should consider. What about this? But it's also designed that for those persons who are more experienced, who are coming from a much more maybe potentially, maybe attachment-based background, or coming from much more of a psychological perspective, maybe coming from much more of a therapeutic background, somebody coming from much more of maybe understanding in terms of a learning disability background. I expect you to go deeper with the questions in terms of understanding that. So if we take a look, for example, this is the way it's designed. In terms of the model, that, for example, there's the 5 factors down the left-hand side. So we look at the nature of it, the extent of the harmful sexual behavior, victim characteristics, sexual aggression, sexual knowledge, attitudes and interests. What I have given you on the right-hand side are items. Now, those aren't scored, but these are the items. What I'm saying are the things that you should, at the very minimum, you should be considering in order for you to be scoring and considering how worried are you about the nature of what this young person has done. So these are 8 memoirs, and every one of these are bespokely and can be individualized to that young person. So for example, if that young person has done a behavior that is not considered within any of these items, you can add that item and you can consider that. But you can also consider the cultural perspective, the race perspective, the gender perspective, any sort of religious perspective that might have come into this young person's life, which has a part to play in their overall pathway and developmental. You need to consider, and you can add that in as an item. So the model becomes a bespoke item to that young person. Therefore, no AIM3 assessment should be the same as for another person. It should have unique factors within it. So if you're taking a trauma lens, let's use that sort of more common language of that trauma lens. In domain 1, what I would expect you to be doing is therefore think about what meaning has the sexual behavior got for this young person. So what meaning, what does it feel like for them physically, sexually, emotionally, cognitively? What does it feel like? And if you think about that sensory impact, what does it feel like for them to have actually engaged in this behavior? As opposed to it being about that sexual, it's also about physiologically, what did that mean for that young person? What did their trauma, their experiences, what did this rediscover for them? What did it reinforce for them? What did it, what did it re-challenge them in terms of being able to think about what it means for them? Looking in terms of the extent of the harmful sexual behavior, in terms of really getting a sense of how long that has gone on for the young person, and how often, and very sadly, whenever you're completing these assessments, how often we can see that this young person has actually been completing, and engaging in having their needs met inappropriately sexually for such a long time, but people being afraid to name it. And it's not until it was very overt behavior that then they present then, and then next thing then it's about escalation of risk. One of, I feel, the areas that I feel a lot of risk assessment models miss out is actually about really genuinely understanding, why did they choose who they chose? And that tells us a lot about young people. It tells us a lot about trauma. It tells us a lot about, why do we engage? Why do we relate to the people who we relate to? Why do we choose to be in relationships with who we choose to be in? Why do we choose those friendships? Why do we choose it? And this is exactly the same from a HSB perspective. What I'm wanting here is bring victims into the room. Let me have a real sense of, who is this person? What does that person mean to you? And I wanted it to be more than it was because they were there. It, give honor to the victims. It's more than just because you were there. What did you mean to this person? So it's really about seeing it through that lens of understanding why they chose whom they chose. Was it about an anger towards that person, who they represented? Is it about a gender? Is it about a race? Is it about an age? Is it about that relationship in terms of, attachment? Is it about choosing another sibling because they believe that other sibling has a better attachment to the parent? What is that about? And it's really about exploring the choice of their victim beyond a sexual identification, beyond it being just because they were there. And I suppose I struggle sometimes when often, as particularly within siblings, it was a sense of, well, it was because of easy access. And I'm going, do you know what? No, it isn't. It's not about that. It's about encouraging you as practitioners. And I sort of feel a bit bad using this word, but do you know what? I'm probably going to do it anyway. It's about sort of saying, let's stop being a bit lazy. Think about that magnifying glass for me. It's about asking a few more questions. Sometimes what tends to happen, I feel, within assessments, because a lot of our previous assessment models tended to be a bit more tick box, and this is not minimizing, and that's not that, but they didn't necessarily lend towards analysis. They didn't necessarily lend towards but why. They didn't necessarily lend towards a cross-referencing of a cross, or hold on a moment, but that links within that. So it's a complicated, complex tool that has been written as simply as possible to be used at a different layers. So therefore, I want you to explore why the victim, who are they, bring them into this assessment, because I need to be able to funnel that down. So from a trauma lens, it's about beginning to understand, what did that person mean to them? And again, what I want you to think about is that sensory. What did that person, so how did they see that person? How did they hear that person? How did they smell that person? What did they say to that person? And it's really about recognizing that for any of us, in terms of having experienced any sort of trauma, is that we hold trauma within our senses. We hold it here in exactly the same way as, whenever I'm teaching the stuff around sexuality, one of the key messages I've always said to people is, get your assessment out of their trousers. It's not about genitalia. We hold sexuality and sensuality in here, up at the top here, because it's what we see, it's what we hear, it's what we smell, and also what we say. And that's exactly the same places where we hold negative experiences as well. So therefore, what did this feel like? So I want you to get a better sense, if we're doing a trauma lens approach within using the AM3, and very much for me going through that, very much that sort of coming from much more of a Gestalt, I suppose, background, which is my background, and therapeutic way of working and humanistic way of working as a humanistic psychotherapist, is about really exploring and getting that person to go to that extra length of being able to go, but what did that feel like? And it's not you as practitioners beginning to feel, but I'm not qualified in, and I'm not that. I think words like trauma block us to ask the questions of, how are you? What did that feel like for you? What did that mean for you? How did you feel after that? How did you feel during that? Tell me more about that. What I'm seeing is that this is how you felt. What I'm seeing is you describing this, but your body's telling me something different. So really using your own eyes to ask further questions, not rushing to tick the box. Yes, I'm worried about that, so that's a 4. So it's about really exploring it in a lot more depth and allowing much more of an analysis in terms of the discussion that has to take place. But also in terms of, if we move in terms of looking at the sexual aggression, okay, and violence, really getting a sense of where does that fit for that young person? What role has aggression had for them? What have they seen through their lens? That, do you know what, maybe for them aggression pays, because that's what they have seen. They have seen that in order to survive, I need to use aggression, because that's all that they know. And that's their modus operandi of working in general in life. And therefore, this is more than just having used sexual aggression during the HSB. It's actually about an act of survival. And that's what they know. None of this is about minimizing the absolute harm, of course, to the victim, but this is about really trying to understand HSB in its greater, deeper sense, in terms of from much more of a trauma perspective. But also for me, for example, if we look at factor 5 in terms of sexual knowledge, attitudes and interests, of course, then it's about, I'm asking you to look at their level of sexual knowledge, sexual regulation, about preoccupation, the use of pornography, all of these things. These are all of the items that I'm saying. Please consider all of these, ask about these, explore these with the young person. But it's also about making sure that, you know what, in the exploration of that, hear what it must have been like for that young person. Hear what must it have been like to, for example, have grown up in a domestically violent home, and hear the sexuality that goes with that, to hear the language that goes with that, to then hear the make up sex later on and trying to make sense of that and what did that feel like for them, and trying to understand that, and then how those messages are replicated in whatever pornography they've chosen to watch, because that's what they believed sex was. So it's really about understanding the messages that has embedded within that young person, and that within that young person, the lens in which they see things is, that's how things work. That's what I know. And therefore, that's what I feel safe with. To reframe that for that young person, and reframing that, is actually really frightening, because you're trying to, within therapeutically, reframe that in a much more safer, respectful way. And often, I mean, I have to say, genuinely, I genuinely struggle when I ask practitioners, are you doing some sex education? And they talk about, yes, we're doing consent. And I just struggle fundamentally with our focus entirely upon consent, because 9 times out of 10, we're dealing with young people that have reasonable IQs who actually know consent. But as practitioners, we seem to struggle with, we've done some work on consent. That's it, it's done. Could you actually give them some decent sex education? Not just consent, but actually how their body works physiologically, to understand that whenever they hear anger, whenever they hear raised voices, how come they get an erection? So that whenever they can hear something, that actually physically, their body physically responds to that. But actually we sit comfortably in consent. So let's just talk about consent. Consent's over here, and we'll cover loads and loads and loads. And I have people who often sit with a young person for weeks upon weeks upon weeks with consent, and then they don't seem to understand then why this young person's gone and done that. When in actual fact, if this young person themselves has been a victim of sexual abuse, and that sexual abuse in itself has also been extremely aggressive and violent towards them, but they've also, let's go before that, if they've also grown up, for example, as I've said to you, being exposed to domestic violence, and that heightened awareness of all of their senses to aggression, to violence, and the adrenaline and the pumping of what that feels like, of constantly living in that situation, it is no wonder that as a 14-year-old boy, when they hear that, there is an immediate sexual arousal to that. And that's really about really bringing that together, as opposed to feeling as practitioners, I need to talk to him about consent. Absolutely, consent is very, very important to talk to. But if I'm dealing with a young person with a reasonable IQ, I will spend maybe one session on that. What I will spend more time on is understanding that emotional regulation of the connection between the adrenaline, the arousal, how that is arousing them, that real sense of that they need to do something about how they get aroused to that anger, what that anger does for them, this physiological arousal to it, the sexual arousal to it, and as a result of that, they need to do something. And it's really about making sure, therefore, although each one of the factors in the model are scored individually, what I expect as practitioners, depending on your level of expertise, depending on your level of experience, depending on your level of I suppose, comfortableness with it, that I expect you to delve deeper as to what does that actually mean, and really explore and be able to understand for that young person, this is what this is about. It's about the fact that they themselves have been a victim of potentially sexual abuse, or maybe a victim of domestic violence. There may be a victim of coming from an incredibly physically aggressive home, and therefore tactically, and I mean that from the physical touch, physically, emotionally, cognitively, physiologically, sexually, their whole body becomes incredibly aroused and excited by the thought of an aggression. That's what we need to work with, as opposed to ticking a box and just saying. So the model is asking you to please explore these in a lot more of that detail. Domain 2 asks you very clearly to look at that non-sexual behavior in terms of, how is this young person in terms of their general behavior non-sexually? And that's that bit where I am honestly working on this bit of, once you've done this sexual bit, could you put it to the side and don't allow it to therefore really affect everything else you do. Give an objective assessment to each one of the domains. And the non-sexual one, if we look at that from a trauma background, really about beginning to understand, and what has that been like for this young person? How have they, if you look at the factors, we're looking at their non-sexual criminality, their non-sexual aggression, antisocial behavior, their use of alcohol and drugs, their general behavior, their mental health and well-being. Again, if we're going to use a trauma-informed and developmental-informed lens, but for me, a biopsychosocial perspective on this young person, this is about beginning to understand, if they're coming from that background, how do they feel about themselves? You know, what is their mental health and their well-being? What is their perspective on the world? How do they see that? I think for me, one of the biggest ones within this domain is how so many people keep saying to me, when I ask them about alcohol and drugs in any consultations, where they'll say to me, no, he's not taking any drugs, he just takes cannabis. And you're sort of going, what? And it's really about recognizing is that the population we're dealing with here is between that 13 to 18 years of age. This is not me being a fuddy-duddy old person, which I now recognize I've now become. I've now become this old person now. Is that we need to genuinely, as practitioners, it's not about legal age of drinking. And it's not about me being old and saying people can't have a drink. It's about fundamentally understanding that their bodies are growing. They're adolescents, their bodies are growing. Every drug and alcohol they put into their bodies fundamentally affects their ability to grow. And as that affects them, it will continue to allow and distort how they perceive the world. If they need a blurring on the lens of the world, and see drugs and alcohol as that, if you need to have a blur on the lens of the world, it's like, adding, that level, if any of you go to the opticians, as you can see, I wear glasses, and when they put the different things in front of you, that you basically get the stage where you can see nothing, and the opaqueness and the opaqueness and the opaqueness goes, you can see nothing. You should be asking yourself, why does this young person need to blur their lens to the world? So what role has alcohol and drugs got? It's not just about the fact of disinhibition, because that's what we're thinking about in relation to HSP. It's not about disinhibition. Disinhibition, that's very good there. That's maybe go back over how to say that. It's really about understanding, why does this young person need to blur their view of the world? What's happened to them? What does alcohol and drugs do for them? What is it that they're trying to block out? What are they trying to cope with? What are they trying to dull? Because don't forget, it's about dulling the pain of something. So it's really about exploring that in a lot more depth and understanding of that. It's about beginning to understand from that mental health and well-being. So biologically, what are they doing to their bodies? What does that mean in terms of the lens, in terms of how they look at things? It's beginning to then understand that if they're not engaging with peers without drugs and alcohol, what does that tell you about them? But if we go from the perspective that maybe if this young person is a victim of abuse themselves, alcohol and drugs will enable them to dull, not face what means to them. But it also has told them as well, depending on the environment and where they've come from, which will slip across into domain 4, it will begin to let them understand, well, actually in this family, this is how we deal with things. This is a coping mechanism. And therefore, I'm always very clear about this in relation to self-harm. It's about making sure I have respect for the resilience and the choices of the manner in which they show that resilience. So whether that is that they have chosen to cut themselves, whether it is they've chosen to do it through alcohol, whether they've chosen drugs, whether they've chosen food, because again, in relation to both bulimia and anorexia, or whether they have chosen other things in terms of harming themselves. But I want you to be able to see, in terms of looking at domain 2, take that into a different level for me, in terms of, it's not just about is the usage and therefore that's disinhibition and therefore that's what they did. What I need you to be thinking about is go back to adolescence, recognizing that as an adolescent, let's be realistic, we didn't need much to be able to add that extra stimulation in our life. But why are you taking so much to really dull? What do you not want to see? And think about it from that bit. If you want to use these concepts of, I suppose, that lens, alcohol and drugs dull that lens. So why are you dulling that lens? And really beginning to think about that. Domain 3 is that developmental bit, which is that bit around really looking at what experiences they have had to date and what are the triggers within it. One of the things, and I'm bringing up this one in particular within this, is I struggle, and again, more than happy to be challenged on this. It's happy to do that, but I struggle with the fact of, let's make sure we hear the young person's experience of their life first before we label them as a victim of trauma. Give them the respect to have had their life without us saying, oh yes, but you're a victim of. And I suppose that's the wee bit I have around adversities at the moment, is a bit of, I feel them often becoming a tick box. But yes, he experienced this, 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 and this. That's five adversities. And what we've lost is, stop. I could have experienced one adversity in my life, and that one adversity could have set me on such a pathway of impact on my development that I didn't need 3 other adversities. So what's tending to, I think, impact is that bit of, right, I've got that now as practitioners, that's ticked that box, that's what that is, and we label that. So what I'm asking you in this domain, if you're looking at it from a trauma lens, is hear the experience. Does the young person see themselves as a victim? What's their perception of it? Because do you know what? Everybody I know have these experiences. So am I really a victim if I think that actually that's the norm? They may not realize they are a victim of a trauma until we start working with them, and therefore honor that. So it's about making sure that we hold back our professional diagnoses, our professional need to label, our professional need to do that, without making sure we listen to it. And I think one of the, here in Northern Ireland, I think there was a brilliant, I mean, this genuinely to me summed this up for me brilliantly last week, where on a radio show in Northern Ireland, a lady, quite an older person lady, I'd certainly say I'm assuming her to be probably well into her 80s, actually said on a radio show that, you know, during the Troubles, you might have had the bombing and you might have been blown up and you might have been shot, but you didn't have the COVID. And you know what? Think about that. And actually what that means is that woman would say, I lived in risk at that time, but that was a risky time. But I knew what my risk was. This is an unknown risk that I'm likely to actually, you know, potentially die from. And there's something about that, is that somebody would just say, and I think it's this perception that people have, and I think that's why genuinely I believe those of us from Northern Ireland of a certain age, we understand trauma because this was our life. And I think it is that bit of, it's about life, it's about understanding it, it's about understanding it in more than just asking, what was it that happened? Do you know what? See, for a lot of people, there isn't something that happened. It was just, but this is my life. And I think sometimes as practitioners, we seek to get to an event that happened or an incident that happened. And it's basically, as that elderly woman's describing, you know, COVID isn't an incident that she can actually put her hand on, and therefore it's harder for her to cope with. It's a much more of a greater risk for her. It's a greater trauma for her. It's a greater sense of, I have no control over this. I can't stay away. I can't protect myself. I can't do whatever. Because she knew probably during the times of the Troubles, if I stayed away from certain areas, I probably will be okay. And although that, and that's that sense of really understanding what do we mean by trauma and victimization and adversities, and making sure that we ask more about that, making sure that we're not looking for an incident, we're not looking for an event, that we're not looking for that, but hear the story, hear the life, hear the description, hear what that was like for that person, and begin to understand not how you make sense of it, but how the person makes sense of it. And what have they done to be able to survive that? And often the things that actually were the things that allowed us to survive very difficult situations absolutely then become our dangers because we need more of them in order to block them out, like alcohol or drugs or whatever that might be. So therefore, in this developmental domain, what we're looking for here is what have been those experiences, and is the trauma unresolved? And I think it's this bit as well as a presumption, which I think is a bit of a professional arrogancy, to be honest. This presumption that people can't resolve traumas unless they sit for 2, 3, 4, 10 years, whatever it is, in therapy. Do you know what? People can heal themselves. They can heal themselves by talking to some other individuals. They can heal themselves by understanding. So I think it's about really making sure as practitioners that people can have had experiences, but how are they resolving them, and are they unresolved? So again, with young people, listen to that. How have they coped with, how have they made sense of it? How have they made sense of what has happened? How have they made sense of that lens? And how do they see it now? And if it is unresolved, and we've got those signs of being unresolved in terms of impacting on day-to-day functioning, absolutely, let's score that, let's identify it, let's work with it, and let's make sure that we see it as something we need to provide some intervention for. But it's about making sure we don't label when somebody says, but there was this, that we then, that means that they've been a victim of this. This does not mean victim. An incident does not mean victim. It's for the young person. If you need to allow somebody to tell the story, tell them their pathway, tell them their life, tell them what's happening for them. But that also, it's not about an incident. It's about understanding how they've existed and what's it like for them. In relation to then, obviously, the adversities, it's about family crisis. It's about not minimizing. And I mean, of all people, I would say to you, do not minimize the impact of the domestic abuse on them and what that's been like for them, and particularly if they've been exposed to that perinatally. But also in terms then of looking in terms of the quality of attachments, in terms of, again, I think often, again, I suppose I struggle with this. And obviously we have Clark on the call, who's again, that absolutely lovely trainer in terms of working with attachments. And it is a bit of really recognizing the attachment is not what you professionals think of the person. Because often where I've seen in reports where people have said, yes, well, his father's a bad attachment. And I'm going, well, why is the father a bad attachment? Well, because he's in criminality and all of that. And I says, but that's not what attachment is. Attachment is a felt sense of emotion and security to that other individual. And it's really about beginning to understand that even with the father having this negative criminality, if that young person has got that sense of attachment, that must be honored and it must be recognized, acknowledged, and we need to think about that. The influence of the father is a completely different thing, but that's not what the attachment is. So what I wanted to do in this model was bring attachment into the assessment, but really understanding the quality of that, because I think one of my things in terms of with AM2 was where we were asked, is that, one consistent parent in their life. You could have had a one consistent parent in your life, but you may not have any attachment to them. So it's about quality of it. And it's asking you to assess and understand that. But also in terms then of family functioning, how has that family function generally? What is this, how does this family generally, what does the young person generally experience with this family in terms of how they function? What is it like for them? What has it been like? What have they seen through that family lens? How does this family deal with crisis? How does this family deal with chaos? Does this family create chaos? Does this family generationally accept that sexual abuse happens in this family? That's the narrative, and that's the script and the family script. And it's really about understanding then, therefore, for that young person, through that lens, what did they see? So keep always thinking about understanding it, not necessarily putting, for me, about a trauma lens, because I think that already prejudges what you're going to, how you're going to ask those questions. But it's about asking, how did you see your world? How did you see how you grew up? What did that mean for you? What did that feel like for you? What was that sense of being a member of this family, and what did it feel like? The third or the fifth factor within this domain is really looking at that health, intellectual and emotional function in terms of how this young person works in terms of an emotionally, their sense of perception of themselves, their empathy skills. Obviously, then, do they have they developed then that emotional congruence of prepubescent children, which would be of obviously of concern because we're dealing with an adolescence, their education ability, their physical health. And I suppose what I wanted you to really look at here is from that biopsychosocial sort of the trauma lens, is about understanding when a young person is living in a trauma or traumatic or dysfunctional or chaotic home or whatever they're coming from, or whatever words you wish to describe that, is that it very much goes to the core of the sense of self. And it's as one young girl would have described to me whenever I was very early doing this work and therapeutic work with victims of sexual trauma. And as she described to me, she was very, very, very clear how she felt about the perpetrator of her sexual abuse, which was her father, in relation to ongoing 3 years of penetrative sexual abuse against her. Language warning here, okay, but she was very clear, speaking directly from her. It was, he's a bastard, was always a bastard, and will always be a bastard, and that was not my fault. And that was very clear. So she had no, when we were doing her therapeutic work, there was no unresolved feelings that she needed to resolve in relation to the perpetrator. She was very clear what she heard from him when he was sexually abusing her and outside of the sexual abuse times was negative, negative, negative. What she felt in relation to the sexual abuse was a very negative, painful experience. There is no cognitive in between this. There is no sense of a sensory, cognitive, physical, any, at any level, any confusion. Bad man did a bad thing, and that was not my fault. Very clear about that. But what fundamentally went to the core of her being was, did I not matter enough for my mother to protect me? And I think that's really what we mean by when we're working in trauma. It's, did I not matter enough? And if you fundamentally believe you don't matter enough for somebody to step in, it goes to the core of who you are. It goes to the core of your sense of self, and it goes to the core of your sense of self-worth. And I think one of the hyphened words that I believe has become so minimized that I really genuinely often worry about has been where somebody might write, somebody has low self-esteem, and it's read in a report as low self-esteem. But you know what? Having low self-esteem, you couldn't get more lower than that. And that really means they've lost a sense of self-worth. So if we're looking at this developmental domain through the lens of trauma, it's about genuinely understanding, how do they perceive themselves? Are they somebody who they perceive themselves to be worthy of being protected, worthy of being cared for, worthy of being somebody that we will take an interest in? And that is that bit of where, again, we need to realize you may remove the child from the hand that has done the harm, but you will not remove them from that sickening anticipation of never knowing when it's going to happen again. And I think for me, that's one of that core things of learning that I've always had. Every day that I work with a victim, every day I learn something new from them that I regret with a vengeance. Why did I not know that when I started in this business in 1988? Why did I not know what I know now, to be able to go back and think, I missed that. I missed that person that had actually said that to me. I didn't pick that up. I didn't think about that because probably then I was waiting to hear the big one. And think about that. How often, whenever we as practitioners, how often we as practitioners are often sometimes waiting to hear the big one, because I think we have begun to get to a stage where we've minimized the impact of the small ones. For example, for me, a young person who has lived with neglect, to me, has suffered as much, if not more, than somebody who has suffered with sexual abuse or physical abuse, because it must go to the very core of your being. Did I not matter enough to feed? Did I not matter enough to clothe? And did I not matter enough to keep warm? So again, I think we minimize the impact on our developmental pathways of functioning young people who come from severe poverty and neglect. And certainly having worked for years in the field of psychiatry and, border, Northern Ireland, where there is poverty and extreme poverty and absolute poverty, where we have people growing up in such extreme poverty. I think we've minimized today what poverty does and neglect does in terms of being able to grow and a sense of self. So let me really ask you to really think about this when you're in that domain 3 and you're doing your assessment. It's about an understanding of taking that lens. Don't be listening out for an incident. Don't be waiting to hear the big one. Hear the story, hear the life, hear the pathway, hear the understanding, but understand the lens of which they see it through. And it is to be respected if at this stage they are not saying, no, I'm not a victim. Because do you know what? For them, that's what life is. Going right back to my elderly lady, that's what you grew up with. That's what life is. Professionally, academically, standing our way back, can we see that person? Yes, we can, but that's not for me to tell them that is. They have a pathway of a therapeutic journey that they need to work to, because when you remove that from them and their sense of what they thought that was and their cognition of that, you remove probably what has been the building blocks of resilience for to have enabled them to be able to cope with life to date. And I to be really careful about that, because are you going to be there to make sure we build that up? And that's why I feel within EM3, what I wanted to be able to do, and hopefully able to do, and I'm not necessarily saying always we are able to do it, but I wanted to make sure, could you sequence your interventions, make sure that we don't try to give a young person and send them down a pathway of an intervention of, say, for example, 6-week session on anger, when the core root of that anger has its basis in trauma, but in actual fact, we're sending them back home to who caused that trauma, and we've not done anything about that. So it's really making sure we sequence, and it's making sure we have the building blocks to make sure for success. Because the next thing then is we're looking at is that environmental and family, in terms of understanding where they came from, what has been that background, what has been the things that have informed them, and who are those. And I mean, I think one of the things, I know that if Simon was joining me in this today, one of the things him and I both talked about here, and he was very strong and was in that factor one, was when we had these conversations around how many houses, shall we say, buildings. I refuse to use the word homes, because I don't think any of them necessarily always become homes for them, but how many buildings these young people have had to live in. And with each building move, the less and less they gather with them. And I think that should with anybody, when you're doing an EM3 assessment, should immediately be cross-referencing back there into that domain 3, about stability and safety, and what does safety actually mean for somebody, and that we can live in chaos, and we can live in a very, very chaotic home, but that chaotic home might actually be as safe as it gets, because actually I feel attached to the people within it. That chaos could be a chaos for all sorts of different reasons, but I may not feel harmed within that home. Because also, how many young people, and I think this is what for me is very clear, is, and again with professionals, what I'm finding is how many are making an assumption of safety and an assumption of stability if the young person comes from a standard professional middle class home. And there's like, well, it's an assumption of safety. Whereas what we're finding more and more, particularly those young people where we're finding through technology-based type of abuses, whereas they could be the loneliest children we have in our society. because they are in their bedrooms from when they walk in until they get up the next morning, with nobody opening the door and going, hello, what are you doing? What are you at? Come downstairs, join in the family meal, have a connection. Because in actual fact, we have lonely children in our middle class. They may have technically that building, they may have the food, clothes, warmth, but actually what they don't have is that emotional warmth. I may have a kid who doesn't necessarily always have all of that practical bit, but they may not feel lonely. And I think it's that bit of, let's again get that sense of thinking about that loneliness and into stability and safety. But also that domain four is looking at parental and carer supervision. And it's about really understanding what is the parent's background. How can I ask somebody who themselves has been a victim of abuse to try to now supervise their son who's maybe caused harmful sexual behavior, when maybe that parent really resents the son for doing it? This is, a narrative that has now happened. It's like all males are going to do this, or all females, or whatever it is. So again, it's with really understanding from a trauma lens and an understanding about a psychosocial lens as what's going on within this family system, and what's it, have they got both the capacity and ability to supervise. For this, in terms of supervision, what I would use is the model that myself and Gareth McGibbon have developed, which is the CASPER, the capacity and ability to supervise and protect and risk. And to be able to run that alongside an AM3 in terms of understanding, has a parent even got capacity? And that how often we're saying to parents, right, you now need to supervise your son. And you're just going, what? Supervise? He's 15 years of age. He's 6 foot. How am I meant to do that? What is that like for me? How am I physically able to do that? He's the one who's actually nearly older than the parent. So again, it's about really understanding, from looking from a trauma lens, why that mother can't assert that authority, why they haven't been able to do it, and why does the father unable to do it. So again, it's about making sure when we're doing our assessment interviews with the parents that we keep that lens open for them as well. What has happened to them that has informed how they have parented, but that also sadly will inform potentially their inability to protect and supervise from here forward. It's also looking then in terms of, that if you're looking from a trauma lens, we're also looking at how that affects our ability in our relationships, how we develop relationships, how we make relationships. If I don't feel I matter enough, how would I feel that other people want to be my friend? What persona do I have to take on to be a friend? What persona and part do I have to play? And I think this is where I have always strongly felt that the role of drama and drama therapy, and again, Clark's on here in terms of being able to look at those, being able to get young people to work within that sort of one person remove, that sense of being able to look at what does that feel like for them, and the multitude of masks that they put on in order to try and maintain friendships, relationships, being part of that peer group. And really, really important to understand, how does that inform that? And what does that persona mean for them? And what does it feel like for them? But also, as well as that, in terms of then looking at education, employment, their background, their leisure, what's the pursuit, and understanding, I think, again, with bringing our education colleagues on board in terms of what does it mean for them, that whenever we suspend a young person from school, even though they've never committed a HSB in that school, even though they have never been, committed any other problems within that school, what message does that then further add to that young person in terms of looking at it from that trauma perspective, that they now don't matter enough to educate? That's not okay. And if we are very clear, and I think that's why I'm clear as practitioners, I feel it was a detriment, and it is a detriment. And I genuinely believe the same as adults as well, but that's a whole different other webinar. In terms of, you know, being able to give these, we may feel comfortable in our languages of medium and high risk, but what a school hears is that's a risk and they're not going to be able to cope with that risk. What a young person who's coming from that, potentially, if you're doing it from a trauma background, is basically saying, you don't matter enough for us to educate. That goes again back to the core of that young person. So we need to really challenge, hence, An assessment model must be bespoke, must be individualized. They must be able to actually identify who do you pose a risk to, under what circumstances, and what can we do to limit that risk. And you know what? Where do you not pose any risk at all to anybody? And you know what? Let's build on that. Let's make that okay. And let's statutorily hold the education to account, for you have a statutory responsibility to educate our young people. And it is not all right to just say you're not worthy to not be educated. We must, and therefore it means something to them. So again, fighting it from that very much that trauma lens. The last domain sort of focuses on very much how that young person regulates themselves. And it looks about in terms of, taking, what's that been like for them to take responsibility, and particularly when they're coming from maybe a background or a family of what does it mean for them about responsibility. And it's incredible whenever I'm doing the M3 training, how often I have to say to practitioners, would you ever give that young person a break? To admit to some of this stuff is the hardest stuff in the world. And I will take you right back. And for me, these were hard lessons that I had whenever I was working as a social worker in mental health in OMA. It was the best job in the world. And I think everybody should work within mental health for a period of time, because it genuinely made me realize that for every question I ask, I must be ready to acknowledge the fear of answering. If you ask a question and you understand there's a fear in answering, you will ask it in a much better way and an easier way. And therefore, taking responsibility for something, I admire somebody who's able to do that, because that's hard stuff. And it's really about understanding, what does that feel like for that young person? What is in terms of their future perspective? For me, somebody to have no future perspective is genuinely very sad. One of the things for me working with victims of sexual trauma, and certainly any of the victims I work with, for me, dealing with a lot of the impact stuff from having been abused, whether that's nightmare self-harm, whether it's reoccurring dreams, whether it's this loss of sense of self, those sorts of things. Do you know what? We can work with all of those things. But you know what I cannot replace, and it's one of the things which is the saddest element of being a therapist, is I can't replace hope, because somebody took that away from them. And one of the things I think we need to be aware of is, what are we doing to build hope? And that's why future perspective is in this model. It's about, from a trauma informed way, developmentally, if I have a 14-year-old boy or girl who has no hope for the future, this is bigger, wider than HSB. This is right back to the core of, do I not matter enough? And we really need to engage that young person in having a sense of self, and a self that they can achieve, and that they can achieve within their means, and that's really important. So making sure we hear that loss of hope, hear that loss of sense of future, because that's critical to mental health and well-being. We need to instill some hope. We need to instill that the person who has taken some of that away from them, that we can instill some of that back in, and we've got to be able to do that. So engage and spend time in that. And that's not about giving them unrealistic dreams, but it's actually about, realistically, what can we hope for and what can we help make them work for. But also then in terms of looking and helping them look at their social competency and where they are. And again, about who has made them feel important about themselves. What is their sense of who they are, where they fit within the world? Have they a sense of social competency as to who, as to what they can achieve and what they're able to do? And some of that is just basic life skills. And it's about a basic sense of being able to assert themselves and their social skills. And do you know what, around interventions, spend as much time, which is why I'm very clear that the model is designed that each domain must be addressed individually, in that it is important for me. I'll give very quick example where I had a young person, and yes, he committed her really serious HSB. And whenever I met him, this young fella had one of the most serious skin complaints I'd ever seen. So much so, I could hardly look at him without actually me cringing. His face was absolutely weeping. And I spoke to the social worker immediately after it. And she said, well, he's the perpetrator. And I fundamentally said to her, I said, you have abdicated absolutely your professional ethical background. He has the right to receive healthcare the same as everybody else, because while his face is weeping, he can't lift his head. While he can't lift his head, he doesn't feel he's worth anything. For as long as he's not worth anything, nobody else is going to think he's any worth anything. And then we're into, and because then a lot of his HSB was because he didn't feel good about himself. The only thing he felt good about was that he was doing this. I said, why do you feel because he's a perpetrator? He's a 14-year-old lad who has the right to receive and a sense of being able to feel that he has the right to treatment, the same as everybody else. And I think it is about making sure, if we're taking this through a developmentally informed model, and if we want to use that trauma lens and a biopsychosocial, that we make sure we challenge ourselves as practitioners. We maybe stop being lazy in our assessment, ask a few more words, put that magnifying glass onto them. It's just asking you ask a few more questions, but really see it in that holistic picture, but also being prepared to challenge our other professional colleagues who have chosen to make the decision because this is the perpetrator, then they don't get seen as this. Whereas in actual fact, these are young people whom we know, and we all know, that if we work with them at this stage, then the likelihood of them going on to commit further offences in adulthood is actually very, very slim. And we know that. But it's about recognising it is because of where does that, did I not matter enough for somebody not to think to bring me to a doctor to see to me about my skin? And that's that bit of, I suppose for me, trauma lens is about, do I matter enough? Don't get caught up in the theory words. Don't worry about the theory words. Don't let the theory words block you from asking those questions. Think about it as asking, magnifying to see more about that young person and bringing them more into the fore. The model, hopefully, you find the model helpful to be able to help you to do that, depending on whatever level you work at. So seek to understand the behaviour in the context the young person experiences. Think about how many lenses that young person sees the world. It'll be multiple lenses, not just a trauma lens. It'll be multiple lenses, but how that affects their young person's experience in terms of their attachments, their emotions, both positive, negative, and their arousal, but how it affects their intimacy, their sexuality, their relationship with people, but fundamentally how it affects themselves. And that therefore analyze that information to develop bespoke interventions which are fully trauma informed in relation to content, how it's delivered, reviewed, and assessment. And hoping that you'll be able to take that just to that deeper level, which is what the model is designed to be able to do. Thank you. And I think 11:15 on the dot, which is not bad, Malcolm, I have to say.
It's
surprising.
It's not bad. It's amazing.
It is amazing considering it's me. So happy to take any questions if there's any.
Marcella, can I say really, really quickly, thank you so much for that super informative summary. I mean, there's some massive information then. Just to remind delegates that we will be sending both a copy of the video and also a copy of the slides to those of you who attended. Marcella, I've sent you a message with the summary of questions, which will maybe help.
Okay.
But could you start off the questions? Marcella, there is a number of, there's a theme. People have been asking about intellectual levels. So whether it's possible to use the model with people who are intellectually
okay, let me answer that.
So the question about the age group, because over the age of 18, is that possible?
Yeah, in terms of then what we did was we basically identified every factor, what we're saying within these 5 domains that you should consider with any person who has committed or is accused of committed or alleged of committed HSB. And then what we've done in one of the chapters of the book is then what we have said is, and if that young person has a learning disability or a learning difficulty, is that you need to then consider that, and you would consider that then as then the additional element that you would bring in, and you can add that in each of the items. So you would consider that in the items because you're not scoring the items, but you would bring that in within the items. You would consider their intellectual disability in each of the factors under the items as to how would you score then the overall factor, and it allows and enables them to do that. In relation to the over 18, personally, I use this for if I have a young person who has committed a HSB under the age of 18 and they have not committed any further, to the best of our knowledge, a sexual offence post 18, but they're still, for example, to me, sort of 18, 19, and I've used the oldest person I've used it with is actually a 21-year-old, is that I have used the AM3 to help guide me of what were they like at the time. And I've used that in terms of understanding it because they committed the offence when they were 15 years of age. I then ran the factors again as a graph as what is that young person, what's that young adult like today? And I've done that to compare the graphs in terms of are the same issues and concerns. And then what I did then was I would have then matched it against any of the adult assessments. So it's quite a complicated way of doing it. But if it's, if to me, for example, if that young person is still sort of under that sort of 20, 21 years of age, where they haven't committed an offence post 18, I have used the AM3 to be able to do that. And I've guided and consulted people to do that, to be able to see, has that developmental change happened? But what you'd be, if, for example, you're providing that report to court, you would need to obviously say that the model is designed for those people under the age of 18. Okay, so maybe if I take a look at the emphasis, I'm going to read out some of these questions and then, but if anybody else wants to come in, emphasis, move away from the language of risk. Why in the profile graph and the red scoring does the language revert back to relative risk and risk management? In relation to the only time you're talking about risk mismanagement is that obviously that if you're sitting with red, I'm very realistic in the realistic world, is that sometimes we do have to make we have to take it's something to manage if there is such a risk, because we've always got to remember at the upper end of any young person that we're dealing with. So for example, if I'm dealing with a young person, as I did 3 months ago, where he had committed 4 stranger rapes in quite a random fashion, I have no doubt I had to be talking about the language of risk management and to be able to do that. So I think in some cases we have to be very alert to that, and I have no issue about people talking about risk management and being able to put into risk management plans, because that fits within some of the structures that we have to work within. My background is coming from health and very clearly within health, but I work within the criminal justice side as well. So I have no issue in relation to talking about risk management. What I won't talk about is that somebody is a low, medium or high risk. In terms of its asset, can it be adapted for people with colour impaired vision or visual impairment, especially as red-green colour vision impairment in past at least was more common in males? In relation to you being able to use, there's a graph is actually for yourselves as practitioners within the model. If, however, you're working with somebody where absolutely you're right in terms of colour blindness, in inverted commas that would have been, if again you feel the need whenever you're describing this or wanting to work with a young person and you feel another colour works best, do you know what? Absolutely, you be clear to do that. I would absolutely hate for the colours to stop you being able to work with a young person, express that. Please do that. That's what you need to do. What I would suggest though, whenever you're putting, say for example, a report through to court, is that you would go back to revert back to the original colours, but in your sessions with young people, use what colours make sense to them. With the emphasis in AM3 to move away from the language of risk, we've got that one. Can abuse children with LD needs? Have said that. How do you work with a young person who continues to deny incidents? I appreciate the reasons why he wouldn't. Okay, the question is, how do you work with a young person who continues to deny? I appreciate reasons why he wouldn't admit. However, it's difficult. I tend to speak hypothetically. Okay, great question, and thank you for that. Thank you for all of the questions. The key thing here, firstly, don't forget, is to see the 5 domains. And this is what critically is really important. It's about actually saying to the young person, you are denying, what you have done, and that will obviously impact on domain 1, but it doesn't affect on any other domain. So all of the other 4 domains can all be fully engaged in, fully worked with, fully addressed, and all of that. What I would do then with domain 1, and what I do is that I am very clear with the young person, is that, so talk to me within all of this. If you're saying you've absolutely, and I think it's also about the words of deny, what do we mean by that? But if the person is then, what I say to them, what I'm going to include in there is what you've been alleged of. And I work on the allegation bit. But what I'm clear to them is the other 4 domains are nothing to do with their denial of these offences, because they're got to do with this. And that's about engaging that young person. Normally what I would do then is I would work on those 4 domains, and then I go back to the domain 1. To acknowledge the reason for assessment, but then as a building relationship and trust, address other domains before the sexual behaviour. I'm not quite sure what the question is in that. Question 7 there, Malcolm. Okay, to acknowledge the reason for the assessment, but then as a building relationship and trust, address other domains before the sexual behaviour. I'm presuming that is about building the relationship, and that acknowledge. Yeah, the importance of building the relationship, and that I'm always very honest as to why I'm doing an assessment with a young person. My style of working is that, and I do the same with adults as well, is I undertake all of the interviews, talk to the young person, and then I get them to sit down with me with the workbook, and I talk them through, look, in this factor, here's the things I'm worried about. If that was me, I would say I'm quite worried about that, and so therefore I would score that a 4. What do you think? Sometimes I ask the young person first, once I know that they've got into the remit of it, where would you score yourself? And I would have to say generally 9 times out of 10 they're usually matching me, and then we agree to disagree, obviously then on some of the ones. Usually we fall out over things like alcohol and drugs and things like that might be, but and that's when I'm called that I'm old and I don't understand, and that's fair enough. So yeah, so I think it is important to go back, use the other domains, and it also, it gives them a message of that you want to know about them and their experiences and what's happened to them and what about them and their life, before we focus on what your genitalia are or what your hands did. The question 8 has asked me, I'd like to know if EM3 is suitable for young people with learning disorders, and what I'm saying is yes, it is. And what you would do is then you would, under each one of the factors, you would consider then an additional item. And so whenever you're trained in EM3, whenever I would be training you or any of the EM associates, is that what would be saying then is add in any additional considerations under each one of the items before you would score a factor. 9, in the EM3, has Marcella found a strong correlation between self-regulation and harmful sexual behaviour, i.e. the lower the ability to self-regulate, self-soothe, correlates with higher levels of HSP, and how this connects with developmental peace where this young person didn't experience co-regulation as an infant, toddler and beyond? Okay, yeah, I mean, absolutely, in terms of there is the correlation. I'm always struggling to always say the strong correlation, because I think if there's a correlation between the self-regulation and HSP. And I think that is that bit, is their ability to, I suppose, manage the range of arousals. And I don't mean all sexual arousals, but heightened arousal emotions. And that's, I suppose, is why I gave you that example of the young person who, from the moment of conception right through, in terms of being exposed to that high adrenaline as a result of domestic violence and abuse, is that he becomes very sensitized to all loud noises, to shouting, but even if there's no shouting in the house generates an arousal because of what's going on, because the walls are throbbing with what's going on, what's happened, and all of those sorts of things. So absolutely, it's about how have they managed that, but it's about that dysregulation, and it's about attachment. And often what your mind might find is the young person who didn't experience co-regulation often might tend to present then with issues in relation to attachment, because obviously therefore, because the parent hasn't been seeing to their needs, so you generally will linking it in then in relation to their attachment. 10, can we have the reference for the Casper supervisory model? Yeah, the Casper, it's CASPR, and it is the model for assessing the capacity and ability to supervise and protect at risk. And if probably the best reference I can give you for that one would be is if you want to go on to either McGibbon Consultancy, which is MCGIBBON Consultancy. Or if you contact me through my email, we can set you up with getting trained in the Casper model of assessment. Somebody has said to me, I don't think in every case that it's laziness on behalf of the caseworker. I think that it's fair. Yeah, look, that was me being a bit cheeky, and I understand that. But I think we also professionally also, I suppose that sometimes I worry how quick we are to blame the young person for not engaging. Whereas I think sometimes professionally we have to also go, did I give that session as much as we could? And I think sometimes from a supervision point of view, supervisors, I think, could give more energy and advice and guidance to practitioners as well. But it's not meaning to be disrespectful at all to any of my colleagues. Okay, I'm just trying to see. What advice do you have for a school who have 10-year-old with profound learning disabilities with HSB, and can the model be used? The model for persons under the age of 13, you would use the AIM under 12 model, which is on the same framework, and that you would have to do the use the under 12 model because it allows for much more of that developmental between the 0 to the 12. So use the AIM under 12 model for that. And in relation then with profound learning disabilities, again, it's about recognizing that you can do that. I don't know whether or not should I open up for people to ask a question now, or if
surely I'm aware we're over time, but
oh, are we right?
we've still got 136 people listening, so please, there's one question I've just seen about an AIM assessment alongside an ARMS assessment. I know you'll understand that well.
Yeah, yeah. What I would be saying to you is it doesn't sit alongside an ARMS assessment because ARMS is for 18 plus within that the police use. I also feel as well as that is I don't feel that the ARMS assessment gives a fully rounded assessment of a young person, because it's that's not what it's designed to do. I think if you're going to give a full comprehensive assessment within it, then you'd use AIM3. But I understand, for example, that if that young person, for example, is reaching 18 plus, that the police might need to then undertake an ARMS assessment as well, because they've maybe reached 18 and need to be able to use it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I think Marcella we'll draw things to an end, and just to say again a massive thanks. That was not only super informative, it was inspiring at times, and so thank you very, very much. Just to say to the delegates who are here, there's around about 150 people on today. About 80 of you are members, and the rest are not members yet. And obviously we'll send you some information about membership of NOTA. Just to say that we're trying to put on sessions like this on every month or so. Next month we got a session on technology assisted abuse, which is on in the middle of December, and the information is on the website. We will be writing to you with a request for some feedback from today. Please do fill that out and tell us what you think, so that we can make sure that the sessions we're putting on are really meeting your needs. So thank you all very, very much.
Yeah, and that people can receive, if people want AIM3 training, they just need to contact AIM. Just go onto the AIM website so they can contact AIM. Yeah,
we'll make sure the links are on the information that we send out from this session. Thanks, Marcella.
Thanks very much, Malcolm, and great to see so many friendly new old faces as well as new ones. Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you
so much.
No problem. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Yeah. I'll send you a message, Marcella and Malcolm.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.